Roughly 34% of adults in America, Canada, Australia, and even the UK now listen to podcasts on a monthly basis. So with roughly 2 million podcasts listed on Google, there's an audience of well over 150 million listeners globally already. And that stat is growing at a rate of about 20% each year. Now, people are time poor, right? And they've begun to rely more heavily on mobile devices. Search engines are giving preference to podcast content, and it's become even easier to download and listen to podcasts as you sort of make your way through your day. With podcasting becoming such a prolific and highly influential method of communication for both individuals and companies, I thought it might make good financial sense to invite the host of a very successful podcast in America to talk about why you should seriously consider adding podcasting to your list of things to learn and launch this year. So I want to welcome to the show Travis Chappell. He's the founder and CEO of Guestio. It's a software that connects high-level guests with high-level content creators. And he's also the host of the top-rated show, Build Your Network. In addition to being featured in Entrepreneur Magazine, NASDAQ, Yahoo Financing, and ReadWrite, Travis has been featured in Forbes as a top 10 podcast that will change your life, alongside people like Joe Rogan, Gary Vaynerchuck, Tim Ferriss, and a bunch of other household names. Welcome to the show, Travis. I'm super excited to have you here today.
Yes, ma'am. Happy to be here. Thanks so much for having me.
Hey, I would really love it if you could share with your listeners how you first kind of discovered your voice at the age of 12 and what those experiences taught you.
Sure. So I grew up in a somewhat religious background, I guess you could say. Really, technically a really religious background. Basically, I went to the same school/church from the time that I was in kindergarten until the time I graduated college. So to give you an idea, I graduated kindergarten, 8th grade, high school, and college on the same 20-acre campus, which is also the campus that I went to church on. And so the path that I was kind of put on when I was a kid was one that was, pushing me toward full-time Christian ministry. So when I was 12, I went to my first ever, what was called preaching camp at the time, which is how, I spent my summers, I guess. And it was basically just a college level homiletics course, which is homiletics is, basically the art of preaching. And it was basically like an interim. So it was like a week long college course that would be an entire semester's worth of work that we did in a single week as a 12-year-old. And that was the first time I ever got up in front of people and started to, do some public speaking at that point, and kind of kept doing that all throughout junior high, high school, and college. Really, just anytime I could get up in front of people and speak, I was doing it. And we had these different competitions and stuff, and we'd have preaching competitions, and then we'd have humorous interpretation competitions and duet acting, and just got into all that kind of stuff, kind of branching off of getting in front of people back when I was 12 years old.
Yeah. So you learned that you love to communicate.
Yeah. And I wouldn't necessarily say that I loved to communicate, but I definitely learned how to communicate, I guess. And when you pick up on skills at a younger age, I think you have a tendency to be drawn toward them later on, because you pick up things so much easier when you're a kid, you know what I mean, than when you're an adult. So it's a little bit easier to jump back into those types of skill sets if you worked on them a bunch when you were younger and the stakes weren't as high.
So today it kind of seems that when people need cash for something, they start a GoFundMe campaign, right? Back in the day, you were kind of an innovator, weren't you, Travis, with Go Weed? Can you tell the audience, how you took this simple concept that most people are going to be able to easily relate to, and you leveraged it, kind of to the hilt by building relationships?
Yeah, so it was a landscaping company basically when I was junior in high school. It was the summer before my senior year of high school. So I was must have been 16 at the time, barely had my driver's license so that I could drive around and mow people's yards. But it stemmed from that simple, call to action that you just said, which was, anytime growing up that I wanted to get spending money for something, regardless of what it was. It was, a video game or a toy or a trip with friends or whatever it might have been. My parents were always good at like, they took care of basically all of my, obviously all my living expenses and all those types of things. But anytime I wanted something extra on top of everything that they provide, the answer was usually, well, there's a bunch of weeds in the backyard, so go weed. You know what I mean? So they paid me like $5 an hour back then, which I'm pretty sure is against some sort of child labor law, but I didn't mind it, obviously, because I got to make a little extra cash. And so I kind of took that principle when I was a little bit older and started to realize that you could get paid actual money to do some landscaping things. And so again, kind of on the back of my parents, my dad was a real estate agent. So he knew a couple of real estate investors that were flipping at the time. And so we started working for some of these investors and bidding jobs and putting in front lawns to like put lipstick on flips before they would turn them around and sell them. And then we'd also pick up some lawn mowing jobs and along the way as well. So that kind of turned into my first kind of business, which we ran in high school. So heading into our senior year of high school, it got down to the point where obviously starting school again, I was just too busy to do the work. So that whole summer prior, it was me and one of my best friends, and we were just doing the work all summer. And it was a cool little gig. We made a little extra money and had some money to spend on some stuff. But we also just kind of hung out while we were working and got the jobs done. But when school started up again, it was literally impossible to go do the labor on the jobs. And so I had just sold a couple of jobs right before the semester started. So I was kind of forced to go hire a couple people. So I actually went to the college that was on the same campus as the high school. And as a senior in high school, I went out and hired 3 to 5 of the college students to do the manual labor on the jobs that I was doing. And that was really like one of the first big lessons that I learned about the value of sales and building relationships, because it taught me that, like, I remember sitting there doing the math in class one time, obviously not paying attention to what the teacher had to say. I was just doing the math on how much money I was going to make on these 2 jobs that I had sold prior to school starting, that I had done 0 of the work for. Like, I would just drive by them after school and make sure that the progress was happening. And that was about it. And so when I looked at how much money I was going to be making, I was like, wow, I just made more money than the people that I'm paying to do the work on the jobs. And it was this big, aha moment for me, just a big green light that was like, wow. So the real value isn't in doing the actual lifting and the actual labor. The real value is in creating the customer relationships. And because there's no shortage of people who are willing to work, but there is a shortage of deals. So if you can be the one to make the deals, then you can find the people to work.
Yeah, exactly. That makes a lot of sense. How specifically did you make the determination or the leap that podcasting was going to be the right vehicle to get you where you wanted to be? Because you've come from, quite a sales background, and then all of a sudden you made a massive shift and you were into podcasting.
It was not super easy and it took a long time. But at the end of the day, I just knew that what I was doing at the time, which was door-to-door sales and stuff, I just knew that that wasn't going to be where I ended up long-term. It was not my long-term career. And I was in a weird position where I was just frustrated. You know what I mean? I knew that I didn't want to be doing what I was doing, but I didn't know what I wanted to do next. And so it was kind of just felt stuck, felt frustrated, didn't really know where I was going, where I was headed, or what I wanted to do. So for the first time in my life, I dove into personal development, started reading some books, listening to some audiobooks, finally dove into podcasts for the first time. And then after listening to a bunch of them, I was like, I think this could be kind of a cool way to generate an income. So I got started with it, and I had no idea where money was going to come from or how I was going to monetize or how long it would take. I just knew that I should probably figure out this online business thing, because this seems like the future of business anyway,
Yeah, what were your expectations of podcasting and how you thought you might make an income at the beginning before you started?
Yeah, I thought it would just be through the regular way that everybody thinks, right? Like getting sponsors, getting a bunch of downloads and, stuff like that. But I was faced with a harsh reality that downloads don't just come on your show because you launched. Even if you launched correctly, like I launched correctly, I hit the top charts, I had a bunch of ratings and reviews, but the downloads weren't following, which means that the money wouldn't follow. And so I was kind of at a standstill again. And that's when I really just started focusing on my listeners and the people who would give me the time of day, and just trying to figure out on how much value I could bring to them in what period of time. And then I was able to really like get to know some of their pain points and some of their obstacles regarding the topic that I talked about a lot. And that kind of helped me formulate my first real product or service online, which was like a small mastermind. Was that just, a few listeners of the show came in, and that was my first ever monetization point, which was about 6 or 7 months after I launched the podcast, and realized that, downloads aren't going to come just by launching a show. They're only really going to come if you market it a bunch. And the only way to really market it a bunch is if you can learn how to make some money when you don't have a ton of listeners, which is what I made, which is, the goal that I had at the time.
Do you remember what you were charging for the mastermind?
Yeah, I think it was, like $1,000 for 3 months with one-on-one coaching. So it was like a really good deal and a ton of value, but it was the first ever thing that I charged for. So I could understand people's hesitancy to trust me at that point, because there wasn't really a reason to. And but that's why I priced it that way. And I also included like an $800 event ticket to some event that was going to be in town. So when I say I didn't make money on it, I quite literally didn't make any money on it. I almost spent every dollar back into getting them like more value for it. But at the end of the day, like that's what I had to do at the time in order to be able to sell people into it. And then I was able to get some testimonies, and then sell another round, and then sell another round, and then keep raising prices, adding more value, figuring out more what the products and services were, et cetera, up until to today.
Now, in particular, I read that you absolutely idolized John Lee Dumas, and you really wanted to be a guest on his show, Entrepreneur on Fire. How did you make that dream happen?
Simple answer is pay to play. Sometimes you got to be willing to put your money where your mouth is. And I feel like people get way too offended way too easily at stuff like that, where it's like, oh, I want to be on your show. And it's like, okay, well, it's X amount of dollars to be on my show. And it's like, how dare you charge me money to be on your show? And it's like, well, start your own show then, and be a guest on your own show. Like, I don't understand why people get so upset when people ask for money in that context. But that was basically the answer for me. So he was hosting a mastermind at his house in Puerto Rico. It was $6,500 for the weekend. And then if you bought that experience, you also got to have an appearance on his podcast. And so I looked at that as my opportunity to be able to make that happen.
What do you think was the number one takeaway that you got from that weekend?
Relationships, hands down. I don't even remember a lot of the material and stuff that we've talked about. And I'm sure that a lot of it now is pretty outdated, or at least outdated in the sense of what my business is or what it does. But it's mainly the relationships. I still am good friends with a couple of the people that were out there and that came out there with us. And I'm, still good friends with John and Kate as well. So definitely the relationships was the biggest thing that I took away from that.
Fair enough. Why do you think that podcasting has exploded the way that it has in the last few years?
I think we're seeing kind of a regression back into the audio space, because audio is just an easier way to consume content. If you look at what television did to radio, it kind of eliminated it, because radio at the time wasn't something that you just consumed while you were out working out or something like that, because it was impossible to do it that way. It originally was like families gathered around this giant box in their living room to hear a story on the radio unfold from week to week. So when television came out, it obliterated the radio, because it was simply a better form of consuming that content, because it gave that visual aspect as well. And television really, led the way up into the early 2000s when podcasts came out. I believe they actually came out a little bit before YouTube came out. But podcasting, because it was basically just online on-demand radio, was overshadowed really, really quickly by YouTube, and then by all the social media platforms that came out, by Facebook and Instagram and Twitter and all these other ways to consume content, and all these other content platforms. Podcasting got overshadowed a bunch by all of those things. But then what started happening is people realized that they couldn't consume content on all those other platforms with the same relative ease that they could on a podcast. Meaning that when you tune into a video, usually you're giving it your full attention. Whereas when you tune into a podcast, you can be at the gym, you can be working out, you can be in the car, you can be doing dishes, you can be mowing the lawn, you can be doing whatever you want to do, and you can just have AirPods in, or a pair of headphones on, and have your phone in your pocket or in the house, and just be listening to quality conversations on a podcast for hours on end. So I think we're kind of now experiencing a little bit of a regression away from video back into audio, because it frees up the most valuable asset that people have nowadays, which is their time. And when you can free up somebody's time, that to me is a really big win. And I think that's kind of what's happening in the podcasting space and why it's starting to blow up again, because people are starting to realize the power of having a podcast and the power of consuming podcasts. And especially when it comes to the listener behavior and the relationships that you can build through the audio platform that you just can't do on video.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Who do you think should start a podcast? Do you think it's just for business owners? What are your thoughts on that?
Anybody that wants to be above average in whatever they do is my answer. People in
I love that
business,
answer. I love
people
it.
in business, people in their career. You know, I used to say everybody should start a podcast, but maybe everybody shouldn't start a podcast, because some people are totally okay with being average. And it sounds like I'm saying it in a negative type of a tone, and I genuinely don't mean it that way, because not everybody has the same goals as the drivers and dreamers of the world. And some people just want to be able to live their life, collect their paycheck from their 9 to 5, hang out with their friends on the weekend, and retire on their 401k. And you know, if that's you, good for you, do that. But for anybody that wants to live a life that's above average, I would say starting a podcast is a really good idea.
Do you think that podcasting is something that people should be thinking about getting into because they're trying to make money from it, or because they genuinely want to add value to their listeners, or they genuinely want to connect with people?
I don't think it necessarily has to be an either or. The reason I got into podcasting was to make money from it. You know what I mean? Like that was you won't make money from a podcast unless you put the value to your listeners at the very forefront of your mind. Like the money won't ever come unless you do that thing first. But that doesn't have to, like, the reason that you jump in doesn't have to necessarily be that first thing. Like for me, it was definitely making money. Like that was the reason that I jumped into podcasting, because it seemed like an intriguing way to make a living. I wanted to be able to, you know, travel the world and set up my show on automated when I left and have it actually generate me money while I was gone without having to think about it. I wanted to be able to have that location freedom, that financial freedom, that time freedom to be able to do what I want, when I want, with whom I want. And podcasting offered that. So I don't think it's necessarily a bad thing to get into it because it makes money, but you also do need to understand that if you get into it and you don't ever shift your focus on helping people and you only focus on making money, then making money on a podcast is going to be extremely difficult for you, because the only real way to build an audience full of listeners who care what you have to say is by focusing on what their needs, what their obstacles, what their problems are, and helping them solve those things through adding value to their lives. So they have to go hand in hand, but I don't think either one is necessarily the right reason to start.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. It sort of seems to me that we're kind of living in an age where everyone either is or wants to be an influencer. What tips do you have for people or business owners that are listening right now who want to connect with influencers, but maybe they're not currently one themselves?
Yeah, I mean, since we're talking about it, it's an easy answer for me, which is start a podcast. Um, it's just the easiest foot in the door of any outreach methods that I've ever tried. People are just way more likely to say yes to a podcast interview than they are to say yes to any form of ask on a cold reach out. You know, like a 3-minute phone call, or a quick cup of coffee, or let me pick your brain. Like any of these other type of vague, generic, let's get to know each other requests are usually buried at the bottom of somebody's inbox, or met with a gatekeeper that does their job and doesn't let you through. So a podcast interview is a really great way to just get your foot in the door and connect with that person, and see if there's any way that you can continue to further that relationship.
It's interesting, right? Because you and I probably wouldn't have met under any other circumstances if I hadn't have reached out and asked you to be on my podcast. So
Exactly.
obviously, we're meeting each other today. We're, having a chat, learning about how each other does things. But you must have met some really interesting people through having your podcast.
Oh yeah, no, I mean, we're coming up on episode 600 now. I don't know how
Wow.
many of those are interviews, but I have to say probably around 350 to 400 of those episodes are interviews with different people. So, I mean, I can't even quantify into words the impact that a podcast has had on my network and my connections. It's been the biggest needle mover for my network over the past few years, like hands down.
Well, plus it probably opens you up to concepts and ideas
For sure.
and strategies that you would have never had access to if you hadn't spoken directly to the people who created this stuff.
Correct. Yeah, it's a really great, I call it a discovery tool in that sense. So a lot of people that, if you don't know what that next step is for your career, kind of like what I didn't back a couple of years ago, a podcast can be a really great way to try to discover what that next career path may be for you. That's the reason I have a software company. You mentioned that at the beginning of the interview, and we're building a software company right now. Like, I never really thought that would come out of the podcast, but after having conversations with a multitude of super successful and highly influential entrepreneurs and business owners and CEOs and stuff like that, I got glimpses into a multitude of different spaces, of different industries, niches, business models, a variety of different things I was able to look into. And the one that intrigued me the most was software. So I was kind of always like on the lookout for an idea that I could turn into a software company. And then one day it came to me, and we got started pretty much immediately on that, because I already kind of had the foresight into the industry from people that I had met by interviewing them on my podcast.
Which do you think is the bigger problem? People who have podcasts who are looking for high quality guests, or people who that are high quality guests and have great value are just looking for people to interview them? Which do you think is the main pain point out there?
I would say shows that are looking for high quality guests, because usually if you're a high quality guest, you're getting bookings, or at least you're getting requests for bookings. Now, are they high quality shows that are booking you? That's another good question. You know what I mean? But to me, those relationships start with self-awareness, because you gotta understand who's bringing the asset to the table. And this is something that I think a lot of podcasters in particular get wrong. There's this weird culture in podcasting where people want to feel like they're the all-star because it's their show, and their show is just amazing, and they put so much work into it, and blah blah blah. But at the end of the day, if your show's not good, you know it. Like, it's really clear to look at your download numbers and be like, hey, not a lot of people listen to this show. So if I want to bring on somebody who has a giant audience, who's put in the work, who's earned influence, and is at a point in their career that is unmatched with my career, then I have to come to the table with something besides just, hey, you should be on my podcast, because they have the asset in the conversation. But there could be other people that might come on your show, and these might be the people that you end up charging to come on your show, because, you're not necessarily reaching out to them. They're reaching out to you, and you're kind of like, hey, you could come on, or, couldn't come on. Either way, it doesn't really bother me. Like, your story's good enough to bring you on, but it's not unique enough for me to, like, be proactive about bringing you on. And so, well, yeah, it'll be $500. And then if they pay it, great. If they don't pay it, no worries. You know what I mean? I just feel like, people just get way too much in their feelings about who is bringing the asset to the table, who in the relationship is the one that has worked harder in their career to generate more income, more influence, more fill in the blank. And I think that too often people, like I said, get too in their feelings about that, and almost get offended that somebody would say no to their podcast, and how amazing their podcast is. And they look at their downloads, and they're getting, 62 downloads an episode, and then wonder why everybody's saying no to their podcast. And it's just like, well, you got to do a little bit of research and understand who's bringing the value to the table in the relationship, because that ultimately will depict the dynamic there.
Well, look, and I think everybody starts somewhere.
Yeah, no,
right?
100%.
Every single podcast didn't start with 2,000 downloads or 10,000 downloads. They sort of started somewhere, but you get that feeling, right, of the authenticity and the vulnerability coming through in the hosts and the guests, don't you? You get a feeling of whether people who are doing a podcast actually care about the listeners or they don't.
Yeah, no, 100%, 100%. And that's kind of why I say that is it irritates me, because I started my show from scratch. You know what I mean? And I went through the steps to build the show, and people told me no a lot at the beginning too, but I never took it personally and got mad at people for saying no to me. It was just kind of like, okay, I see you. You know what I mean? Like, you're added to my list, and in the future, I'm going to reach out again, and you're going to say yes next time, because I'm going to have X amount of downloads, or I will have interviewed these 12 people that you already know, and you're not going to have a choice but to say yes. Like, it was more of a challenge to me than it was like taking offense that somebody would say no to an interview on my show, and a lot of times it's usually just because of a lack of empathy for a really, really busy person if you've never been a really, really busy person before. You know what I mean? Like it's hard to empathize with somebody when you don't know what it's like to have 1,000 emails in your inbox every week of people trying to get you to do stuff for them because of the work that you put into your career.
You may find this a little bit of an oxymoron, but in my personal experience, I've found some of the busiest people in the world to be the most generous with their time.
Yeah. I agree with that to a certain extent, but I would say that they are generous with their time if you are somebody that they perceive to be respectful of their time,
Hmm.
if that makes sense. And some people just aren't that way, and then they get upset at the other person for not being willing to give them a bunch of their time. And it's like, well, there's 1,200 other people that want that person's time. So you just have to understand that it's not a personal slight, on you. It's not them saying that you're not worth my time. It's just literally like, I cannot, for that busy person, they're just like, I literally can't say yes to everybody in my inbox. All I would do all day long is like give free advice on phone calls all day if I said yes to everybody. You know what I mean? So the goal is to become a person like someone like you, who is clearly somebody who comes across as being worth giving time to, and that is one of the keys to getting mentors to mentor you in an unofficial way, without paying them to be a coach or whatever, is that you have to be somebody that's worth giving their time to, which is why you have to work on the credibility on your show, and you have to work on the credibility in you and in yourself, and becoming a person of value, and getting in the right circles of people, because it becomes an easier decision for people to offer you their time when you have more value to bring to the table, regardless of whether or not you can use that value for them. It just shows them that you get it, that you're putting in the work just like they've put in the work. And you're going to have a lot more success with people like that, if you can prove to be a valuable person in their network.
Yeah, that makes a hell of a lot of sense. Who do you think were your biggest challenges? Who did you have to, really chase to get and were, really put to the test with?
Oh man, so many people, especially at the beginning, It's so much easier now because I have a roster of all-star guests, you know what I mean? But
Yeah.
when I first started, man, it was difficult, and people gave me the runaround. People ignored me. People rejected me. A lot of the people who have been on my show now were people that originally rejected me. And again, like I look at that now and I'm like, hey, that makes sense. The first time I ever reached out to Grant Cardone, I just launched my podcast. I had like 3 episodes live, maybe, you know what I mean? And I reached out to Grant and I got ignored, but like that's expected. Of course, like you've got people reaching out to you every single day to do this. You have a pick of plenty of shows that would be way more worth your time than mine. It makes sense that I was ignored, but instead of just like, retracting back into my shell and quitting, I basically just went and got a dozen people that were in his circle of friends to come on my show. And then the second time I reached out to him, like 9 months after the first time, he said yes within 10 minutes. And like a week later, I was in Miami doing an in-person interview at his office. You know what I mean? So at first, it was almost every high level person that I reached out to. It was a difficult reach. Grant Cardone was one of them. Jack Canfield, the Chicken Soup for the Soul author, I reached out to him. It took me 9 months to book the interview with Jack, and several unanswered emails, like not even rejections or the polite rejections where they're like, oh yeah, let me give it some thought. You know what I mean? It's basically a rejection. It was literally just ignoring for months. And then finally got that interview on the books after 9 months of reaching out. Molly Bloom was another one that took 7 months to book that interview. There were several of the highest quality interviews that I had at the beginning of my show that took me months of persistent follow up and reach out to be able to get those interviews booked and on the schedule.
Yeah, look, tenacity is a highly underrated skill, but so very important, not just for podcasting, but for running a business, for excelling in your career. I mean, you don't have to be the brightest light on the Christmas tree. You just have to be the last one shining, right?
That's exactly right. You have to be willing to stick in it longer than everybody else. The bottom line is that's why everything comes down to your commitment level. That's why your commitment level matters so much, because if you're just simply willing to outlast everybody else, then you're going to win at some point. You know what I mean? Like that, just some people can't take the heat and they leave and they quit. So if you, this is a phrase that I don't know where I heard it the first time, but I've repeated it about 1,000 times since I heard it. And it's basically something along the lines of, if you will do the things that most people are not willing to do, then you can have the life that most people are not able to have. And that's just the truth. If you'll put in the work that most people will not put in, if you're willing to put up with more rejection that most people will not put up with, if you're willing to be persistent where most people would quit, then you're going to get the results that most people will never, ever be able to have. And that's the bottom line.
Yeah,
You've
look,
got to be
I
willing to do
think
the
it
things
might
other
be
people
Jack
aren't willing to do.
Canfield. I think it might be Jack Canfield or Mark Victor Hansen that said that. It just kind of rings a bell to me.
Yeah, definitely could be. I mean, they said a lot of good stuff, so it could be from them.
They had a lot of good books and had, some really great influence. That's the thing that I think I find most exciting about podcasting. It's like reading a good book like Chicken Soup for the Soul, but doing it live with the actual person who's telling their story.
Yeah, no, it's like free mentorship. You know what I mean? Like when I sit down with someone like Jack Canfield, I get to ask him all of the selfish questions that I want to ask him, all of the things
Yeah,
that I
for
want to
free.
know. You know what I mean? Like, hey, how did you get this to happen? Or I've been working on this thing in the back of my mind. I'm thinking about it, and I can phrase a question that asks him about something that's going to apply to the situation that I'm currently in, and I can apply that advice like right now today from somebody who gets paid, through the course of his career, probably millions of dollars for the same advice that he gave me for free during a podcast episode that I
Yeah,
did
and
with him
even
at his house. You know what I mean? Like live in person at his house, built a great relationship, and he wrote an endorsement for my website afterwards, all because I had a podcast. That's the power of
even
podcast.
better if the questions that you're asking are the exact same questions that your listeners want to ask, and they're
Yeah,
getting the
right.
benefit of it, for free as well. I think
Exactly.
oftentimes we all have the same questions we want to ask these people, right?
Yep.
Because nobody is better to tell you than someone who's actually done it. There's no point taking advice from people who have never been there.
Correct. Yeah, a lot of times, and I'll get some flack for the way that this is worded. But I'll tell people, never take advice from somebody that you wouldn't be willing to trade places with. And I get some flack for the way that phrase is worded. And I don't necessarily mean it to the fullest extent of that phrase. All I really mean is don't take advice from people who you wouldn't trade places with in terms of their success in that particular thing that you're trying to be successful in. So if you want to make a lot of money and your parents never made a lot of money, then you should be careful with the advice that you take from your parents about making money because they've never done it. And it doesn't mean that they don't love you. And it doesn't mean that it could be coming from a really great place. And it doesn't mean that you should ignore your parents. I'm not trying to be one of those people to say that kind of stuff. All I'm simply saying is like, you got to take it with a grain of salt. And it's like, Mom, Dad, thank you for the advice. I love you. And I really appreciate that you love me enough to be able to give me advice like that. Now, but don't be upset if I go listen to a business person's advice that's actually gotten the results that I want over your advice. You know what I'm saying? Because they have the results that I want. So, you can't just keep listening to all these, like, people think that advice is correlated to the amount of love that somebody has for you. And I wish that were the case, but it's just not true. And that's where the majority of people take the majority of their advice is from their close circle of friends and their close family members. And especially when it comes to stuff like money, for some reason, people just take those people's advice when they have never done any of the things that they want to do. And it's like, well, I love you, Dad, but if you've been working a 9-to-5 job for the last 35 years and you get paid, $65,000 a year, and I'm trying to make $1 million a year in my business in the next 2 years, then you're probably not the best person to give me advice on how to do that. You know what I mean? Like it doesn't necessarily mean that you want to trade places with that person in every aspect of their life. It just means be careful who you take advice from, because not everybody should be giving it.
Yeah, fair enough. Well, look, I don't know who said this, but I think it's really an interesting perspective is it doesn't make sense to take advice from people based on stuff that they've tried and failed to do in their own lives.
Yeah. Yeah, very, very similar. And the thing is, I always try to keep my mind open and I try to learn from everybody, but it's going to be with a grain of salt. I'll take what you said and I'll give it some thought, but I'll probably still run it by a few mentors that, have gotten to the point where I want to be.
Fair enough. I want to ask you one last question before we wrap up. And do you think that podcasting has changed the way that the best brands in the world are doing their marketing?
I don't think it has at this point. I think that it has the potential to, for sure. And there's for sure a lot of statistics on the increase of sponsorship revenue that podcasts bring in over the last couple of years, and I know that number is going to continue to increase. But I don't think that enough brands are taking full advantage of it. To be honest, I think that there's plenty more opportunity that'll be coming in the next decade into the podcasting world, really, with just more and more podcasts popping up. I think that's really the big thing. There's 40 million YouTube channels. There's like 1.5 million podcasts. So we're still in the very beginning infancy stages of what podcasting is and what it's going to be. So I'm excited for the future of it. And I think that a lot of brands are going to begin to get more on board with it, especially because when you see institutional type money come into a space, that it's about to get kind of revolutionized. And so that's kind of what we've seen in the past year or two with Spotify, is they're coming up and buying up so many of these podcasting brands for hundreds of millions of dollars. And anytime you see big institutional money starting to get into an industry like that, it's a sign. You got to follow the sign, follow the money. And so right now we're seeing a lot of those institutional money, a lot of that institutional money coming in. We're seeing a lot of big name celebrities that are coming in, people that have been in traditional media for a long time, like people like Katie Couric, and Paris Hilton just started her own podcast network. Conan O'Brien is a big podcaster now. A lot of people that have been a long time in traditional media are jumping over to podcasting now as a main source of their entertainment or content outlet. So I think that it's going to continue moving up and to the right in that direction. So I'm excited to see what happens in the next decade of podcasting.
Me too. I can't wait to see where your show goes, and also mine. Where do we take this? How do we add more value to our customers? I want to make sure as well that, number one, I am super grateful for you being on the show. You're sharing just some really amazing insights. And I think it was great for everybody to kind of hear where you come from and how you've made the pivot into podcasting and how that could be applicable to them. But I also am mindful, and I want to make sure that if people want to reach out and they want to get in touch with you because they want to know more about what you do, they maybe want to purchase some of your products, I want to make sure that they know how to do that. Can you tell everyone what's the best way to get in touch?
Sure. Yeah. You can go over to travischappell.com. It's basically kind of the all-in-one hub where you can kind of get directed in whatever direction you'd like to go. So yeah, just go to Travis Chappell, Chappell, travischappell.com.
Wonderful. Thank you again so much. It was an absolute pleasure getting to know you, and I'm excited to see who you have appearing next on your show. You've got a great show, and I think that your success is very much well-deserved.
Yes, ma'am. Thank you so much for the kind words, and I really appreciate you having me on the show.